The United States gives Israel more military aid than any other country on earth. It provides Israel diplomatic cover at the United Nations. It shares intelligence. It deploys its most advanced missile defense systems to protect Israeli cities. It has fought alongside Israel in the most significant military campaign in the Middle East in decades. And according to the Pentagon's own Defense Intelligence Agency, Israel is now spying on the United States at a level serious enough to warrant the highest possible espionage threat designation. Critical, not high, not elevated, critical, the same designation reserved for America's most dangerous adversaries. Tonight on the Daily Latitude, we go inside the story of how America's closest ally became its most concerning intelligence threat, why it happened, what Israel is looking for, and what this extraordinary rupture between Washington and Tel Aviv tells us about the deeper fractures now running through the most important alliance in the Middle East. I am your host. This is the Daily Latitude. Stay with me. Welcome back to the Daily Latitude. Tonight's episode sits at the intersection of alliance politics, intelligence warfare, and diplomatic strategy. On Friday, June 6th, NBC News and the New York Times published reports citing anonymous current and former U.S. officials describing a remarkable development. The Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, had recently upgraded its assessment of the espionage threat posed by Israel from high to critical, the most serious designation in its internal threat assessment system. Israel denied the reports completely. The White House dismissed them, but the sourcing, multiple current and former officials across both NBC and the New York Times, is serious enough to warrant deep analytical examination. Tonight, we are going to cover 4 specific analytical questions. What exactly is Israel allegedly doing and why? What this tells us about the current state of the U.S.-Israel relationship, what it means for the Iran negotiations, and what the historical pattern of Israeli intelligence operations against America reveals about the deeper structural dynamics of this alliance. Let's start with the facts of what has been reported and be analytically precise about what we know and what we do not know. According to NBC News and the New York Times, citing multiple anonymous current and former U.S. officials, the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency recently upgraded its counterintelligence threat assessment of Israel from high to critical. The reports describe Israeli intelligence agencies intensifying efforts to collect information on U.S. military personnel, government officials, and policy discussions. Specifically, the concern is focused on American officials involved in shaping Washington's approach to Iran. The New York Times named 3 specific individuals reportedly targeted: Trump's Iran envoy and key negotiator Steve Witkoff, the Pentagon's top policy official Elbridge Colby, and one of Colby's deputies. The reports also reference incidents in which U.S. defense personnel working in Israel allegedly discovered software had been installed on their phones to tap their communications. The DIA assessment reportedly found Israeli spying on the U.S. had surged from late 2024 onwards, coinciding with the Biden administration's pressure on Israel over Gaza, and continued increasing through Trump's election. Now, Israel denied all of this. The Israeli embassy called it completely false. A White House official dismissed the NBC report entirely. Al Jazeera could not independently verify the reports, but the seriousness of the sourcing demands serious analytical examination regardless. Now let's examine the strategic logic, because understanding why Israel would take this risk is essential to understanding the broader dynamics of the alliance right now. According to Professor Andreas Krieg of King's College London, Israel is deeply concerned about the trajectory of U.S. negotiations with Iran. From the Israeli perspective, the conflict with Iran that began on February 28th was effectively a joint U.S.-Israeli war. The 2 countries planned it together, fought it together, and together significantly degraded Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. But now, the United States is in a position to shape the diplomatic endgame. And the principal Israeli fear is this: Washington could agree to a deal that establishes an enduring diplomatic framework, potentially lasting years or even decades, that would formally constrain Israel's freedom of military action against Iran in the future. A deal that locks in limits on what Israel can do unilaterally, that removes Israel's ability to strike Iranian nuclear facilities at a time of its own choosing, that creates international legal and political obligations that bind Israel's hands. For a country that has built its security doctrine around the principle of preemptive military action against existential threats, that prospect is genuinely alarming. And according to analysts, Israeli intelligence gathering in this context serves a dual purpose. First, to understand exactly what Washington is negotiating and what concessions it is prepared to make. Second, to identify opportunities to influence, derail, or undermine negotiations that Israeli leaders judge contrary to Israeli security interests. Now, let's be analytically honest about the historical context, because this is not the first time Israel has been accused of conducting intelligence operations against its closest ally. The most famous case is the Jonathan Pollard affair. In 1985, Jonathan Pollard, a civilian intelligence analyst working for the U.S. Navy, was arrested after passing enormous quantities of classified American intelligence to Israel. He pleaded guilty to espionage, served 30 years in federal prison, was released on parole in 2015. The Pollard case remains one of the most significant espionage scandals in the history of U.S.-Israeli relations. It created deep and lasting suspicion within parts of the American intelligence community that has never fully dissipated. Over decades, Israel has sought to penetrate U.S. policymaking circles through both formal and informal networks. What makes the current situation analytically different is the context. Israel is not conducting these operations against a neutral power or a distant adversary. It is conducting them against the country that just fought alongside it in a major regional war, against officials specifically involved in negotiations that will directly shape Israel's own strategic environment. The combination of deep dependency and aggressive intelligence collection is a defining feature of the relationship. Now let's talk about the personal and political dimension of this story, because the reported espionage is happening against a backdrop of a genuinely deteriorating relationship between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the detail that most people following the headlines have not fully absorbed. These two men, who have presented themselves as close allies, are now in open tension over the most consequential strategic question in the Middle East. Trump wants to extricate America from the Iran conflict. Gas prices are at historic highs. Midterm elections are approaching. The war has proved far more difficult and costly than publicly projected, and Trump wants a deal. Netanyahu does not want a deal. Netanyahu wants the Iranian government toppled. Trump has reportedly called Netanyahu, using language I will paraphrase as deeply unflattering, specifically because of Israel's continued escalation in Lebanon. At least 3,500 people have been killed in Israeli attacks in Lebanon. Trump has been pressing Israel to halt those attacks. Israel has continued them, and every Israeli strike in Lebanon risks collapsing the Iran negotiations, because Tehran has made clear that ending all fronts of hostilities, including Lebanon, is a precondition for any deal. The alleged espionage is a symptom of that divergence. Now let's examine how Tehran is reading this remarkable situation, because Iran's perception of the Washington-Tel Aviv fracture directly shapes its negotiating behavior. According to analyst Rob Geist-Pinfold, Iran will likely read the latest espionage reports as enemies basically bickering and misjudging each other. And that reading carries strategic implications in both directions. On one hand, a visibly divided American-Israeli alliance is advantageous for Tehran. It creates uncertainty about whether any deal Washington negotiates will actually hold. It suggests Israel might act unilaterally to undermine an agreement. On the other hand, a fracture between Washington and Tel Aviv makes Israel more dangerous, not less. If Israel believes Washington is pursuing a deal contrary to its interests, the probability of Israel taking unilateral military action increases. An Israel that feels constrained by American diplomacy, but existentially threatened by an Iranian nuclear program, is an Israel with strong incentives to act alone. That possibility, a unilateral strike, is arguably the single most dangerous wildcard. That possibility, a unilateral Israeli strike that restarts the war Washington is trying to end, is arguably the single most dangerous wildcard in the entire current diplomatic landscape. Now let's step back and examine the deeper structural dynamics this story reveals, because the espionage allegations and the Trump-Netanyahu fracture are symptoms of something more fundamental. The U.S.-Israel alliance has always contained a deep and largely unacknowledged tension. On paper, it is a partnership between a superpower and a small regional ally. In practice, the dynamics are more complicated. Israel is simultaneously the largest recipient of American military and financial assistance in the world, and an independent strategic actor with its own interests that frequently diverge from Washington's. The United States has historically managed this tension by giving Israel enormous latitude while maintaining the formal posture of alliance unity. But the Iran war has created conditions where that management framework is breaking down. The core issue is sequencing an endgame. America and Israel entered this war with overlapping but not identical objectives. Both wanted to degrade Iran's military and nuclear capabilities. But America also wanted a pathway to a negotiated settlement that would stabilize oil markets, reduce American military commitments, and allow Washington to focus on the Indo-Pacific. Israel wanted, and still wants, regime change in Tehran. Those two objectives are not compatible within the same diplomatic framework. You cannot simultaneously negotiate a deal that stabilizes the Islamic Republic and pursue a strategy designed to topple it. America has chosen stabilization through negotiation. Israel has not accepted that choice. And in that gap between allied governments pursuing fundamentally incompatible strategic objectives, intelligence operations flourish. So what does the analytical framework we have built tonight tell us about what comes next? 3 specific projections worth tracking. First, the Iran negotiations become significantly more complicated. Every Israeli military action in Lebanon risks pausing or collapsing talks. Every report of Israeli espionage creates distrust within the U.S. team. Second, the pressure on Netanyahu intensifies. Trump's patience with Israeli escalation appears to be genuinely running out. The reported use of extremely strong language suggests a relationship under real strain. If Trump concludes that Netanyahu is actively working to sabotage a deal that Washington needs for economic and electoral reasons, the consequences for the relationship could be severe. Third, the unilateral Israeli action risk remains elevated. The more Netanyahu concludes that Washington will ultimately accept a deal Israel finds dangerous, the stronger the incentive for Israel to act militarily. A unilateral Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities without American coordination would be the most destabilizing possible outcome in this entire landscape. And based on the analytical dynamics, it cannot be ruled out. Here's tonight's analytical bottom line. The Pentagon's reported upgrade of Israel's espionage threat designation to critical is not primarily a story about intelligence tradecraft. It is a story about an alliance under fundamental strategic stress. 2 governments that entered a war together have arrived at profoundly different conclusions about how that war should end. America needs a deal. Israel wants continued conflict. America is negotiating with Tehran. Israel is spying on the Americans doing the negotiating. Trump is pressing Netanyahu to stop bombing Lebanon. Netanyahu is continuing to bomb Lebanon. And caught in the middle, the Iran deal that everyone says is close but nobody can seem to close. The analytical reality is this. The U.S.-Israel relationship is not broken. It is unlikely to break. The structural ties, military, financial, diplomatic, political, are too deep. But it is under more visible strain than at any point in recent memory, and the management of that strain, while simultaneously managing Iran negotiations, Lebanon escalation, and approaching midterm elections, may be the most complex diplomatic challenge the Trump administration has yet faced. That is your analytical briefing for tonight. No spin, no noise, just the analysis that matters. Subscribe, hit like, and tell me in the comments. Do you think Israel will accept whatever deal Washington negotiates with Iran, or will it act unilaterally? I am your host. This is the Daily Latitude. See you next episode.